Betsy Faria. On December 27, 2011, Pam Hupp drove her friend Betsy Faria home after a chemotherapy treatment in Troy, Missouri. Betsy, 42 years old, had been battling cancer and relied on friends for support during this difficult time. That evening would be the last time anyone saw Betsy alive. Hours later, her husband Russ Faria arrived home from game night to discover Betsy's body in the living room, stabbed more than 50 times. The scene appeared brutal and personal. A knife lay near the body, and blood covered the room. Russ immediately called emergency services, but Betsy was already deceased. Police arrived to find a distraught husband claiming he had just come home. But investigators noticed something that would shape their initial theory: a substantial life insurance policy on Betsy's life. Lincoln County authorities arrested Russ Faria and charged him with his wife's ending. The prosecution built a case around financial motive and opportunity. However, Russ had an alibi. He claimed to have been at a friend's house playing games all evening. 4 friends corroborated this timeline, placing him miles away when the medical examiner estimated Betsy died. How could prosecutors proceed with a case when the defendant had multiple witnesses supporting his alibi? The prosecution argued Russ had somehow manipulated his friends into providing false testimony, or that the timeline could be adjusted to accommodate his guilt. The trial in 2013 resulted in conviction despite the alibi evidence. Russ received life imprisonment. His defense team immediately appealed, arguing the investigation had focused too narrowly on him while ignoring other possibilities. What other possibilities existed? The defense pointed to inconsistencies in witness testimony and forensic evidence that didn't align with the prosecution's theory. Blood spatter analysis and the position of Betsy's body suggested different scenarios than what prosecutors presented. Just days before her passing, Betsy had changed her life insurance beneficiary from Russ to her friend Pam Hupp. Pam collected $150,000 after Betsy's demise. This timing raised questions the initial investigation hadn't fully explored. Additionally, cell phone records showed Pam was the last person with Betsy before she died. Yet she had provided testimony that helped convict Russ. The beneficiary change occurred when Betsy was undergoing chemotherapy and possibly vulnerable to manipulation. Investigators later questioned whether Pam had influenced this decision as part of her plan. Russ Faria's conviction was overturned in 2015, and he was acquitted in a bench trial later that year after Judge Stephen Omer ruled that the evidence clearly implicated Pam Hupp as the alternative suspect. Investigation into Pam's background revealed troubling patterns. In 2016, she shot and ended the life of Louis Gumpenberger in her home, claiming he was an intruder. Evidence suggested she had lured him there with money and fabricated the home invasion story. She pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty and received life imprisonment. In July 2021, authorities finally charged Pam Hupp with Betsy Faria's ending. The case had taken a decade to reach this point. Prosecutor Mike Wood stated, "This case stands alone in its heinousness and depravity," describing how Pam had manipulated the investigation to frame Russ while she collected the insurance money. Following numerous delays and a change of venue, Pam Hupp's trial for the murder of Betsy Faria is currently set for mid-2025. However, as of early 2026, the legal community is still awaiting the final verdict in this decade-long saga. She remains incarcerated, serving her life sentence for the Gumpenberger case. The Faria case exposed how tunnel vision in investigations can lead to wrongful convictions while actual perpetrators remain free. Betsy's family waited over a decade for charges against the person they believed truly took her life. while one person manipulated insurance policies for personal gain. The next case would involve a mother and daughter working together. Mark and Sean Stoute. In April 2012, Mark Stoute, 61 years old, died at his Springfield, Missouri home after experiencing severe illness. His wife Diane and daughter Rachel cared for him during his final days. Doctors attributed his passing to natural causes, and the family proceeded with arrangements. But Mark's demise was just the beginning of a pattern that would eventually horrify investigators. In September 2012, Sean Stoute, 26 years old, died under similar circumstances. The young man had been healthy before suddenly falling ill with symptoms his family couldn't explain. Again, medical professionals initially found no obvious cause for concern. Two family members passing within months might seem like terrible luck. But what if it was something more deliberate? In June 2013, Sarah Stoute, 24 years old, became gravely ill with symptoms matching those her father and brother had experienced before their passings. Unlike them, Sarah survived, though she sustained permanent neurological damage. The pattern of mysterious illnesses finally prompted authorities to investigate. An anonymous tip to police suggested looking into the Stoute family deaths more carefully. When investigators exhumed Mark and Sean's bodies for toxicology testing, they discovered both had lethal levels of ethylene glycol in their systems. Ethylene glycol is the active ingredient in antifreeze. Someone had been poisoning the Stoute family members. The chemical causes a sweet taste that can be masked in flavored drinks, making it an insidious poison. Because ethylene glycol, antifreeze, targets the kidneys and central nervous system, it causes a progression from apparent intoxication to organ failure. The medical examiner initially missed this because standard toxicological screenings often do not test for ethylene glycol unless specifically requested. Diane Stoute, the matriarch, and her daughter Rachel were arrested and charged with the poisonings. During interrogation, both women confessed to administering antifreeze to Mark, Sean, and Sarah by mixing it into their beverages. The motive that emerged was chilling in its banality. They viewed these family members as burdens they wanted to eliminate. Diane expressed frustration with caring for Sean and found Mark's presence intolerable. Sarah had committed some perceived offense that made her a target as well. Diane later stated about her husband, "I hated his guts," expressing long-simmering resentment. She and Rachel had discussed which family members they found annoying or difficult and decided elimination was preferable to continued cohabitation. Sean, who had developmental disabilities, required care they resented providing. Sarah had apparently also fallen into the category of family members they wanted gone. The investigation revealed that Diane kept a diary documenting her feelings about family members. The writing showed premeditation and callous calculation rather than crimes of passion. She and Rachel had researched the effects of antifreeze poisoning and understood it could mimic natural illness if administered correctly. The diary entries revealed they had discussed their plan over time, deciding which family members to target and in what order. This evidence proved crucial in demonstrating the calculated nature of their actions, rather than impulsive decisions. Both women pleaded guilty to avoid trial. Diane Stoute received life imprisonment without possibility of parole for the two endings. Rachel received life imprisonment with eventual possibility of parole, with some arguing her mother had coerced her participation. The age difference and familial relationship raised questions about Rachel's culpability versus manipulation by Diane. Sarah Stoute survived the poisoning but suffered permanent brain damage and legal blindness. She gave a moving victim impact statement during her mother's sentencing, expressing both her pain and her path toward recovery. She lost family members and discovered her own mother and sister had attempted to end her life as well. The betrayal compounded the physical damage she sustained. The Staude case demonstrated how poisoning can hide within families, with victims' illnesses attributed to natural causes until a pattern emerges. From calculated family poisonings to a case driven by something far more disturbing. Elizabeth Olten. On October 21st, 2009, 9-year-old Elizabeth Olten left her home in St. Martins, Missouri, to play at a neighbor's house. The young girl loved spending time outdoors and with friends in her small community. When she didn't return home that evening, her family grew concerned and contacted authorities. A search began immediately, with neighbors and police combing the area. What they would discover would shock everyone who knew the families involved. Elizabeth's body was found the next day in a wooded area near her home. She had been harmed and concealed in a shallow grave. The proximity to residential areas and the age of the victim created immediate fear in the community. Who would target such a young person in what seemed like a safe neighborhood? 15-year-old Alyssa Bustamante, who lived near the Olten family, became a person of interest. During questioning, investigators discovered Alyssa's diary, which contained entries that would prove crucial to the case. The writings revealed a disturbing mindset that few had suspected lurked beneath the teenager's surface. In her diary, Alyssa had written about wanting to know what it felt like to end someone's life. After Elizabeth's passing, she made an entry describing the experience. She wrote, "It was amazing, pretty enjoyable," using deliberately misspelled words that suggested a casual, almost gleeful attitude toward what she had done. The diary provided clear evidence of premeditation and her state of mind. But what drives a teenager to such an act? Background investigation revealed Alyssa had experienced family instability and mental health struggles. She had been in therapy and prescribed medications for depression and other conditions. However, nothing in her treatment history suggested homicidal ideation to the extent that became apparent. The case raised difficult questions about recognizing warning signs in adolescents experiencing psychological distress. Her therapists had documented mood issues and self-harm tendencies. But the leap from internal struggles to harming another person caught professionals by surprise. Forensic evidence revealed that Bustamante had strangled Elizabeth with her bare hands, stabbed her in the chest, and slit her throat. She later admitted to investigators that she had dug the grave in the woods 2 weeks prior to the murder. The premeditation was clear from the prepared burial site. She had lured Elizabeth to the wooded area under the pretense of showing her something, making the crime particularly calculating. The shallow grave had been excavated before Elizabeth's passing, demonstrating Alyssa had planned the act rather than acting impulsively. Alyssa Bustamante was charged as an adult and pleaded guilty to second-degree ending and armed criminal action. She received a sentence of life imprisonment with the possibility of parole, plus an additional 30 years. The sentencing reflected her age at the time of the crime while acknowledging the severity of her actions. The judge struggled with balancing juvenile justice principles against the calculated brutality of the offense. Legal experts debated whether someone so young could truly be rehabilitated after demonstrating such capacity for planned harm. In early 2024, Alyssa Bustamante was denied parole for the first time. The Missouri Parole Board ruled that she must serve more of her sentence before being considered again in 2027. The parole board found she had not demonstrated sufficient rehabilitation or genuine remorse. Her case sparked ongoing discussions about how the juvenile justice system should handle young offenders who commit acts typically associated with adult psychopathy. Some argued her developing brain warranted more lenient treatment, while others pointed to the calculated nature of her crime as evidence she posed continued danger. Elizabeth Olten's family expressed that no sentence could restore their loss. They described Elizabeth as a vibrant, loving person who deserved the chance to grow up. Her passing at such a young age for no reason beyond someone's curiosity made the tragedy particularly senseless. While that case involved a teenager's dark curiosity, the next would reveal how relationships built on lies can turn fatal. Ben Rennick. On June 8, 2017, Lindley Rennick called emergency services to report she had found her husband Ben dead at their reptile breeding facility near New Florence, Missouri. Ben Rennick, 29 years old, was a successful breeder of pythons who had built a respected business. Lindley reported finding him with fatal gunshot wounds among the snake enclosures. The initial assumption was that someone had broken into the facility during a robbery. However, investigators found no signs of forced entry or theft. Ben had been shot 8 times, a number that suggested something beyond a robbery gone wrong. The excessive shots indicated either panic or rage, rather than a calculated burglary. Detectives began looking more closely at Ben's personal life and relationships. The investigation revealed Ben and Lindley's marriage had been troubled. Financial pressures from the breeding business, combined with personal conflicts, had created tension. Additionally, Lindley had been involved in an affair with a man who would eventually become key to solving the case. The breakthrough came when Lindley's lover confessed to authorities that he had helped her with the crime. He described how Lindley had planned Ben's demise, motivated by a combination of wanting to control the lucrative breeding operation and collecting life insurance money. The lover initially participated, but eventually decided to cooperate with investigators. His account provided details only someone present could know, including the sequence of events and where weapons had been obtained. Phone records corroborated the accomplice's account, showing communications between Lindley and him around the time of Ben's passing. Digital evidence placed them together when they claimed to be apart. The timeline constructed through cell tower data contradicted the stories both had initially provided. Text messages revealed discussions about Ben and the breeding facility that took on sinister meaning in retrospect. Lindley Rennick was convicted of second-degree murder and armed criminal action in December 2021. The jury recommended a lighter sentence after her defense successfully argued that her accomplice, Michael Humphrey, was the primary instigator. The jury convicted Lindley, and she received a sentence of 16 years imprisonment. Many, including Ben's family, viewed this as lenient, given the calculated nature of the crime. Ben's brother, Sam Rennick, stated, "Those kids deserved a father," referring to the children left without their parent due to Lindley's actions. The sentence meant she would eventually be released, potentially while Ben's children were still young. The case highlighted how seemingly successful couples can harbor dangerous secrets. Ben had built a thriving business and appeared to have a stable family life. Behind that facade, his wife was planning his elimination with another man. The python breeding facility that Ben had worked so hard to establish became the site of his final moments. His expertise and reputation in the reptile breeding community had made him a respected figure, and news of his demise shocked colleagues nationwide. The snakes he had carefully bred and cared for became silent witnesses to a betrayal by the person who should have been his partner. From one secret relationship to a man juggling 2 entire lives. Molly Watson. On April 27, 2018, just 3 days before her scheduled wedding, 35-year-old Molly Watson was found deceased on a rural road near Monroe City, Missouri. She had been shot. The discovery devastated her family and friends who had been preparing for her upcoming marriage. But the investigation would reveal her fiancé had been keeping an extraordinary secret that provided a clear motive. How could someone plan a wedding while plotting to eliminate their bride? Molly's fiancé, James Addy, had presented himself as ready to commit to marriage. The couple had sent invitations and made arrangements for their ceremony. From Molly's perspective, she was about to begin a new chapter of her life with someone she loved. What she didn't know was that James Addy was already married and had been maintaining 2 separate relationships. The investigation moved quickly once police learned about James's double life. How had he managed to keep 2 relationships separate? James had apparently compartmentalized his life carefully, keeping his wife unaware of Molly and Molly largely unaware of his ongoing marriage. As the wedding date approached, the impossibility of continuing this deception must have become clear. He faced a choice between confessing to Molly and his wife, both of whom would be devastated and angry, or finding a permanent solution to his dilemma. Witness accounts placed James in the area where Molly's body was found around the time she died. His attempts to establish an alibi fell apart under scrutiny. The rural location suggested someone familiar with the area who wanted to ensure the body wouldn't be discovered immediately. Forensic evidence showed Molly had been shot in the head, indicating an execution-style attack rather than a struggle. The single shot suggested James approached from behind, or when Molly wasn't expecting violence. Molly's father, Tim Watson, later said about James, "He put off bad vibes," expressing the unease he had felt, but couldn't quite articulate before the truth emerged. The statement reflected a common sentiment in cases where loved ones sense something wrong about a partner, but lack concrete evidence to act on their instincts. James Addy was arrested and charged with first-degree ending. The prosecution argued he chose to eliminate Molly rather than face the exposure of his double life. Coming clean about his deception would have been embarrassing and potentially costly. But ending Molly's life represented an extreme and permanent solution to avoid those consequences. The trial featured testimony about the elaborate steps James took to maintain separate relationships. He had different social circles, kept careful track of his schedule, and apparently felt confident he could continue indefinitely. The approaching wedding created a crisis point where his carefully constructed lies would necessarily collapse. The jury convicted James Addy, and he received life, imprisonment without possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years. The sentence ensured he would never be released. In 2023, a Missouri appellate court upheld James Addy's conviction and life sentence, rejecting his claims that the evidence of his double life was unfairly prejudicial to the jury. Molly Watson's family was left to mourn both her loss and the betrayal of discovering the man she planned to marry had been deceiving her all along. The wedding that should have been a celebration became instead a gathering of people mourning her passing. While James Addy killed to hide a secret marriage, the next case would involve someone desperate to avoid a divorce. Meng Qiji. On October 8, 2019, Joseph Alledge reported his wife Meng Qiji, 28 years old, missing from their Columbia, Missouri home. Meng Qi, who had immigrated from China, had last been seen the night before. Joseph claimed she had simply disappeared, leaving their young daughter behind. The story immediately raised suspicions with investigators. Why would a mother abandon her young offspring without warning? Police discovered evidence of marital discord between Joseph and Meng Qi. The couple had been experiencing significant problems, with divorce discussions creating tension. Additionally, authorities found concerning evidence suggesting issues beyond typical marital disagreements. Investigation revealed patterns of controlling behavior and harm toward Meng Qi. GPS data from Joseph's vehicle showed he had driven to a remote area on the night Meng Qi disappeared. The location didn't match any legitimate reason for him to be there. Electronic evidence proved crucial in establishing his movements during the critical hours. Cell phone data and vehicle tracking painted a picture contradicting his claims of ignorance about Meng Qi's whereabouts. In March 2021, hikers discovered human remains in Rockbridge Memorial State Park. Forensic examination identified the remains as Meng Qi. The location aligned with where Joseph's GPS had placed him the night she disappeared. The discovery transformed a missing person case into a homicide investigation with a clear suspect. Joseph Elledge was arrested and charged with second-degree ending. During trial proceedings, prosecutors presented evidence of Joseph's controlling behavior and the couple's deteriorating relationship. Prosecutor Dan Knight described Joseph as a jealous, controlling psychopath, characterizing him as someone who refused to accept Meng Qi's autonomy or desire to leave the marriage. The trial featured testimony about the couple's final months together. Friends and family described Meng Qi as wanting to escape an increasingly troubling situation. Joseph's behavior had isolated her from support systems, a common pattern in controlling relationships. When she began asserting independence, the conflict escalated. Witnesses testified about observing concerning interactions between Joseph and Meng Qi, though many hadn't fully grasped the danger she faced. The couple's young daughter became a focal point during trial, with evidence suggesting Joseph used her as a means of control over Meng Qi. Joseph Elledge was convicted of second-degree murder in 2021 and sentenced to 28 years. His appeals were exhausted in 2024 after the Missouri Supreme Court declined to hear his case, ensuring he will serve the majority of his term. The case sparked discussions about how divorce proceedings can become dangerous when one party refuses to accept the relationship's end. Legal experts pointed to Meng Qi's case as an example of why safety planning is crucial for individuals leaving controlling relationships. Meng Qi's family in China mourned her loss from thousands of miles away. Their daughter had come to America seeking opportunity and instead found herself in a relationship that ultimately cost her life. The young daughter Meng Qi left behind would grow up without either parent, her mother deceased and her father imprisoned. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. Some tragedies unfold through careful planning, while others erupt in moments of chaos. Marcus Hyslop III. On August 28, 2021, 3-year-old Marcus Hyslop III was playing outside his Kansas City, Missouri home when gunfire erupted. The toddler was caught in what appeared to be a drive-by shooting in a neighborhood already familiar with such incidents. Emergency responders rushed him to the hospital, but he succumbed to his injuries. The senseless loss of such a young life sparked immediate outrage in the community. Who had fired the shots, and why had a residential area become a battlefield? The investigation into Marcus's passing proved complex due to the chaotic nature of drive-by shootings. Witnesses provided conflicting accounts of vehicles and suspects. The neighborhood's history of retaliatory incidents made determining the specific motive challenging. Was this targeted or simply reckless endangerment that tragically struck an innocent bystander? Detectives eventually identified Derek Wren Jr. as connected to the shooting. DNA, evidence, and witness testimony placed him at the scene. During questioning, Wren made statements including, "This wasn't supposed to happen," suggesting the outcome differed from his intentions. Whether he meant to target someone else or hadn't anticipated hitting anyone remained unclear. The forensic investigation established the trajectory of bullets and the position of Marcus when he was struck. Ballistics analysis identified the weapon type used in the attack. Cell phone records and surveillance footage from the area helped reconstruct the timeline of events. Prosecutors built a case demonstrating Wren's involvement, though the exact motive behind the drive-by remained somewhat ambiguous. Digital evidence showed communications between individuals that suggested ongoing conflicts in the neighborhood. Witnesses who initially hesitated to come forward eventually provided information that corroborated the physical evidence, creating a comprehensive picture of what transpired that afternoon. Wren faced charges and ultimately pleaded guilty to reduced counts. Derek Wren Jr. was sentenced to 22 years in prison in 2023 for the death of Marcus Hyslop III after pleading guilty to second-degree murder and armed criminal action. Marcus's family expressed grief and frustration with the justice system. They felt 12 years didn't adequately reflect the permanent loss they suffered. Their young family member would never experience school, friendships, or adulthood because of someone's decision to discharge a weapon in a residential area. The case highlighted ongoing concerns about gun-related incidents in urban neighborhoods and their impact on innocent residents. Community activists pointed to Marcus's case as evidence of the need for intervention programs to prevent such tragedies. They argued that addressing root causes of neighborhood conflicts might prevent future drive-by shootings. Others focused on enforcement, demanding harsher penalties for weapons offenses to deter such behavior. The reduced sentence Wren received sparked debate about plea bargaining in cases involving young victims. Some legal experts argued that securing a conviction through a plea was preferable to risking acquittal at trial. Others believed prosecutors should have proceeded to trial despite challenges, arguing that juries might have imposed harsher sentences if presented with the full impact of the crime. Marcus Hyslop III's short life became a symbol for families affected by neighborhood incidents they had no part in creating. His passing represented countless other young people caught in circumstances beyond their control or understanding. The case remained a point of discussion in Kansas City about public safety and justice. While that tragedy involved unclear motives, the next case would reveal a law enforcement officer who abused his position. Jesse Valencia. On June 5, 2004, the body of 23-year-old Jesse Valencia was discovered on a lawn near the University of Missouri campus. The investigation into his death uncovered his secret relationship with Officer Stephen Rios. The young man's body showed signs of struggle, with forensic examination revealing he had been strangled. Jesse's passing initially appeared to be a case of unknown circumstances, but the investigation would uncover a relationship that someone desperately wanted to keep secret. What connection could link a victim to someone sworn to protect the community? Jesse Valencia had been involved in a relationship with Stephen Rios, a Columbia police officer. The relationship had developed after Rios arrested Jesse on previous occasions. This power imbalance created a situation where Jesse held information that could destroy Rios's career and personal life. Rios was married with a newborn, presenting the image of a stable family man while conducting a secret affair. Jesse had apparently decided to expose the relationship, stating, "I'm going to out him," according to people he confided in before his passing. This declaration made him a threat to everything Rios had built. The prospect of public exposure meant losing his job, his marriage, and his reputation. How far would someone go to prevent that exposure? The investigation into Jesse's demise initially struggled because the relationship between victim and perpetrator wasn't immediately apparent. Forensic evidence proved crucial. DNA found under Jesse's fingernails matched Stephen Rios. Additionally, arm hairs found on Jesse's chest were traced to Rios. The medical examiner determined Jesse died from strangulation, with bruising patterns consistent with a chokehold. The pattern of injuries suggested someone with training in restraint techniques, which aligned with Rios's law enforcement background. Investigators noted the scene showed signs of a struggle, with furniture displaced and defensive wounds on Jesse indicating he had fought for his life. How did investigators connect a police officer to the crime? A key witness, Jennifer Schermerhorn, came forward with information about the relationship between Jesse and Rios. Her testimony provided context that made the forensic evidence meaningful. She described interactions she had observed and statements Jesse had made about the affair. Without her willingness to speak up, the case might have remained unsolved. Stephen Rios was arrested and charged with first-degree ending. The arrest of a police officer for taking someone's life created significant attention in Columbia. The trial featured testimony about the secret relationship, the power dynamics involved, and the forensic evidence linking Rios to the scene. Prosecutors argued Rios eliminated Jesse to prevent exposure that would ruin his life. Defense attorneys attempted various strategies, but the combination of DNA evidence and witness testimony proved overwhelming. The jury initially convicted Rios of first-degree ending, resulting in life imprisonment without parole. However, this conviction was later overturned on appeal due to technical issues, and he was retried and convicted of second-degree ending, receiving life imprisonment plus 23 years. The case highlighted several troubling issues. First, the power imbalance inherent when law enforcement officers become involved with individuals they've arrested. Second, the dangers faced by people who threaten to expose secrets held by those with authority. Third, the lengths someone might go to preserve a false public image. Jesse Valencia's family mourned a young man who had struggled with his own issues but deserved the chance to live and grow. They expressed frustration that someone charged with protecting the community had instead taken a life to protect themselves. The case damaged public trust in the Columbia Police Department and prompted discussions about accountability for officers who commit crimes. Following a second trial in 2008, Stephen Rios was sentenced to life without parole plus 23 years. However, Rios died in prison in early 2025 at the age of 48. From one case of betrayal to a tragedy involving the most vulnerable victims imaginable. Erica Precious Doe Green. In April 2001, the decapitated body of a young girl was discovered in a wooded area of Kansas City, Missouri. The victim's head was found separately, placed in a bag nearby. The horrific nature of the discovery shocked investigators and the community. For years, authorities couldn't identify the victim, referring to her as Precious Doe in an effort to humanize the unknown person while seeking information. Who was this young person? And how had such brutality occurred? The case went cold for years as investigators struggled to identify the victim through traditional means. In 2005, a breakthrough came when the victim was finally identified as 3-year-old Erica Green. She had been from Oklahoma, but had been living with her mother, Michelle Johnson, and stepfather, Harold Johnson, at the time of her passing. The identification opened investigative avenues that had been closed when her identity remained unknown. Investigation revealed Erica had died after refusing to comply at bedtime. Harold Johnson had struck her with an ashtray, causing fatal injuries. The use of such force against such a young person demonstrated a complete lack of appropriate parenting instincts or restraint. After Erica's passing, the Johnsons dismembered her body using hedge clippers and disposed of the remains. Michelle Johnson's reaction when discovering what Harold had done was reported as, "What did you do?" This statement suggested she hadn't participated in the initial harm, but became involved in the cover-up. Her role in the disposal of remains made her criminally liable, though questions remained about the degree of coercion she might have experienced. The investigation into Erica's case proved challenging because the crime had occurred years before identification. Physical evidence had degraded, and witnesses' memories had faded. However, confessions from both Michelle and Harold Johnson provided crucial details about what had transpired. Michelle eventually testified against Harold, providing information about the events and his actions. Harold Johnson faced trial in 2008 and was convicted, receiving life imprisonment. Michelle Johnson pleaded guilty and received 25 years imprisonment for her role in the cover-up. The disparity in sentences reflected their different levels of culpability in Erica's actual demise versus the disposal of remains. The case prompted discussions about system failures that allowed Erica to be in a situation where such harm could occur. Had there been warning signs authorities missed? Could intervention have prevented this tragedy? Child welfare advocates pointed to Erica's case as evidence of the need for better monitoring and more resources for at-risk young people. Harold Johnson died in prison in 2014. Michelle Johnson, who was sentenced to 25 years, was granted parole and released in 2022 after serving most of her sentence. Erica Green's case remained one of Kansas City's most disturbing crimes due to the victim's age and the brutality involved. The years she spent unidentified added another layer of tragedy, as if she had been erased twice, once by her attackers and again by the inability to name her. The eventual identification and prosecution provided some closure, though nothing could restore what was lost. While Erica's case involved family members, the next would show how desperation over debt can destroy lives. Benjamin and Sarah Bonney. On December 23, 2006, Brian Dorsey arrived at the home of his cousins Benjamin and Sarah Bonney in New Bloomfield, Missouri. Brian, who had been struggling with substance issues and accumulating debts, needed help. The Bonnies welcomed their family member into their home, unaware this act of kindness would be their last. What happened that night would result in 2 lives lost and eventually Brian's execution decades later. Brian Dorsey had been dealing with people he owed money to, creating desperate circumstances. He sought refuge with the Bonnies, hoping to escape his immediate problems. Benjamin, 28 years old, and Sarah, 25, lived with their young daughter. They represented stability and normalcy that contrasted sharply with Brian's chaotic situation. Brian Dorsey utilized a small caliber firearm, not a shotgun, to fatally shoot Benjamin and Sarah Bonney in their bedroom on December 23, 2006. The attack proved fatal for both. Their daughter, present in the home but unharmed physically, survived the incident. Brian's motive appeared tied to his drug-related debts and a psychotic state brought on by substances and stress. Some evidence suggested additional criminal acts, though details remain disputed. After the shootings, Brian fled the scene but eventually made the decision to surrender to authorities. He turned himself in and confessed to ending his cousins' lives. The confession, combined with forensic evidence from the scene, left no doubt about his responsibility. The shotgun wounds at close range indicated the deliberate nature of the attacks. Brian Dorsey was convicted and sentenced to death. However, his case would become notable for the unusual coalition that formed in support of clemency. During his decades on death row, Brian apparently underwent significant personal transformation. He participated in educational programs, helped other inmates, and expressed genuine remorse for his actions. More than 70 correctional officers who had worked with Brian signed a petition supporting clemency. His cousin Jenny Gerhauser stated that the execution was unnecessary, arguing Brian had demonstrated rehabilitation. This support from corrections staff was highly unusual and spoke to the person Brian had become during incarceration. Officers described him as helpful, respectful, and genuinely remorseful. They argued his transformation demonstrated that even people who commit terrible crimes can change fundamentally. The coalition included officers who typically supported capital punishment, but made an exception based on their direct observations of Brian's character over many years. In his own words, Brian stated, "Words cannot hold the just weight of my guilt," acknowledging the enormity of what he had done while expressing remorse. His case raised difficult questions about redemption and whether demonstrated rehabilitation should alter punishment for particularly serious crimes. Despite the clemency efforts, Brian Dorsey was executed on April 9, 2024. The execution concluded a case that had spanned nearly 2 decades. Supporters of his execution argued that the severity of the crime, 2 people killed, a young person left without parents, warranted the ultimate punishment regardless of post-conviction behavior. Those opposing it pointed to his rehabilitation as evidence the death penalty isn't necessary when individuals can change. The Bonney family's young daughter grew up without her parents due to Brian's actions during one chaotic night. No amount of remorse or rehabilitation could restore what was taken from her. Benjamin and Sarah's other family members expressed mixed feelings, with some supporting clemency and others believing the sentence was just, from a case decades in resolution to a recent tragedy that shocked observers. Christina Lynn Rentler. On April 28, 2025, 35-year-old Christina Lynn Rentler was shot multiple times in her St. Louis home while 5 young people were present. Christina was pregnant at the time of the attack, meaning 2 lives were lost. The shooting occurred in front of witnesses who would provide crucial testimony about what transpired. What could drive someone to such an act in the presence of so many observers? The perpetrator was identified as Vanier Jones, 28 years old. According to survivor affidavits and witness accounts, Jones became angry and shot Christina multiple times, including shots to her head. The specific source of his anger wasn't fully detailed in initial charges, though the attack's ferocity suggested rage rather than calculated planning. The witnesses to the shooting included young people who would carry the trauma of what they observed. One witness reportedly played dead during the attack to avoid being targeted, demonstrating the terror that filled the home. The psychological impact on these witnesses extended far beyond the immediate physical harm to Christina. Forensic examination documented multiple gunshot wounds, with the headshots indicating intent to ensure Christina didn't survive. The presence of witnesses who could identify the shooter meant Jones couldn't claim self-defense or accident. Their accounts of his anger and the deliberate nature of the shooting undermined any potential defense strategy. Vanier Jones was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree ending, one for Christina and one for her unborn offspring. The dual charges reflected legal recognition that the pregnancy represented a separate victim under Missouri's Protection of the Unborn Child Act. A defendant can be charged with the murder of a fetus, regardless of whether they knew about the pregnancy, provided the fetus was viable or developing. As of 2026, Jones's case remains pending trial. The recent nature of the crime means proceedings are still in early stages. Prosecutors will present testimony from the witnesses who observed the shooting, likely making this a strong case despite the challenge of relying on testimony from traumatized young observers. The case highlighted the vulnerability of pregnant individuals and the compounded tragedy when such attacks result in 2 losses. Christina's family mourned not just her, but also the grandchild they would never meet. The young people who witnessed the shooting faced long-term counseling needs to process what they experienced. St. Louis community members expressed shock that such an attack could occur in front of multiple witnesses. The brazenness suggested either complete rage overriding judgment or a disturbing lack of concern about consequences. Either interpretation painted a troubling picture of Jones's state of mind during the attack. Christina Lynn Rentler's case remained in the public eye as the legal process continued. Her family waited for justice while trying to support the young people traumatized by witnessing her final moments. While some cases move swiftly through the justice system, the final case has waited decades for resolution. Angela Michelle Lawless. On August 6, 1992, 19-year-old Angela Michelle Lawless was found deceased near Route Z in Scott County, Missouri. She had been bludgeoned and shot, her body left in a rural area. The brutal nature of the attack suggested rage or passion rather than a calculated crime. But despite decades of investigation, the case would become infamous not for solving it, but for the wrongful conviction it produced. Who actually ended Angela's life? Josh Keezer was arrested and convicted of Angela's ending based on circumstantial evidence. He maintained his innocence throughout 16 years of imprisonment. The case against him relied on questionable witness testimony and investigative shortcuts rather than solid forensic evidence. In 2009, after extensive review, Josh Keezer was exonerated and released. His wrongful conviction became a dark chapter in Missouri's justice system. But if Josh didn't end Angela's life, who did? The case went cold again after his release, with investigators facing the challenge of revisiting evidence decades old. Advances in forensic technology and renewed investigative efforts eventually led to new developments. Special investigator David James took on the case, stating, "It's time for justice for Michelle," expressing determination to finally solve what had happened to Angela. His team re-examined evidence, interviewed witnesses, and applied modern investigative techniques to a case that had languished for decades. As of early 2026, no arrest has been made in the Angela Michelle Lawless case following the 2009 exoneration of Josh Keezer. While investigators have identified new persons of interest through DNA, the case remains an active cold case investigation. The arrest came more than 32 years after the crime. Details about the evidence linking Lamb to Angela's case weren't fully disclosed pending trial. But the arrest suggested investigators finally had sufficient proof to charge someone. Josh Keezer's reaction to the arrest was complex. He expressed feeling numb and criticized aspects of how the new investigation was conducted. Having spent 16 years wrongfully imprisoned, he had strong opinions about proper investigative procedures and transparency. His advocacy for justice reform stemmed directly from his experience. The forensic evidence available in 1992 was limited compared to current capabilities. DNA analysis, cell phone records, and digital forensics that are routine now didn't exist or weren't widely used then. Investigators working the case in 2024 had tools unavailable to original detectives. However, the passage of time also meant witnesses had died, memories had faded, and physical evidence had degraded. Cold case investigators faced the challenge of balancing modern techniques against the reality that some evidence simply no longer existed or had been contaminated by improper storage methods common in the early 1990s. As of 2026, James Lamb's case is proceeding through the court system. The trial will determine whether prosecutors can prove his connection to Angela's ending beyond reasonable doubt. The burden will be particularly high given the case's history of wrongful conviction. Jurors will need to feel confident that this time, authorities have the right person. Angela Michelle Lawless's family has waited over 3 decades for justice. They endured seeing an innocent person imprisoned while their loved one's actual attacker remained free. The arrest of a new suspect offered hope for closure, but also reopened old wounds. They must now wait again to see if this prosecution succeeds, where the first failed justice. Angela Michelle Lawless deserved better than to have her case become a symbol of justice system failure. The ongoing efforts to finally solve her ending represent an attempt to honor her memory and provide the accountability she deserved from the beginning. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.